So with that, today's presenter is Allison Medford. Allison is our Piedmont Ecoregion Wildlife Diversity Biologist in the Wildlife Management Division. And Allison is going to talk to us today about the unity of game and non-game wildlife management. And so with that, Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? David, can they hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
I hope so. Wonderful. Well, good morning. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. I don't care about Valentine's Day particularly, but it is my 5-year-old's favorite holiday after Christmas. So if y'all love Valentine's like Naomi Jean loves Valentine's, happy Valentine's Day. Like he said, I am a wildlife diversity biologist. Recently moved from the Western region. We've reorged a little bit, and now I'm in the science support team, which I think we're still kind of getting our feet under us, but it has given me a good perspective on sort of what kind of help different folks in the agency are looking for to maximize their effectiveness. So that's been a very useful move, I think. I work a lot with barn owls and bats and other small mammals, bald eagles, but I also spend a lot of time working on the species conservation plans, contributing to the work on the Wildlife Action Plan and other plans variously. So through that, and for just personal likes in general, I'm interested in talking about the unity of game and non-game wildlife management. Many of you know that my
Oops, you got muted there, Allison.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to change slides without muting myself. Okay. This talk really has morphed considerably since I proposed the topic a couple of months ago. Back then, it seemed like RAWA was fairly inevitable, and we were about to have this sea change of funding. And we all know that didn't happen. It might yet in a different Congress, but it didn't happen this time. And that gave me maybe the opportunity to rethink how I was approaching this and really underscore the utility of landscape level management as opposed to single species management to maximize our effectiveness as wildlife managers. Also, I would like to discuss why the dichotomy exists between game and non-game to begin with, how it persists in our agency, whether it should or not, and the future direction of wildlife management in North Carolina. Ultimately, this is a thought exercise, and it's really intended to spur discussion as we prioritize our work rather than being a set of policy prescriptions. I got to speak with a lot of really amazing biologists as I was preparing for this talk. They were gracious enough to take a lot of time to answer my myriad questions and give me a good perspective on where different folks are in the agency that work in different facets of wildlife management. So I think it's a useful conversation to have. I have structured this to kind of go past, present, future. So I want to take a historical perspective, how we got where we are, all that, and then look at the present being single species management with sort of siloed approaches, but moving towards an ecosystem approach where we're increasingly dependent on the Wildlife Action Plan, game lands management plans. We're seeing species conservation plans, the good things that we're doing, and then the places that there are room for improvement. And then finish up by presenting the future that maybe I would like to see, which is a totally bought-in ecosystem approach that benefits the whole of the agency. Oops, hold on. I know that you're not supposed to have very wordy slides, but I did it anyway, because this is our entire legislative charge, which I had not read until I was preparing for this talk. And though it's a lot of words, I think it's really interesting that we are given both a very broad and very narrow scope simultaneously. We're told that to manage, restore, develop, cultivate, conserve, protect, and regulate the wildlife resources with sound, constructive, comprehensive, continuing, and economical game, fish, and wildlife programs. And we're supposed to be knowledgeable of and trained in the protection, restoration, proper use, and management of wildlife resources. That's a lot to do. But we're also given this very narrow scope of wildlife. We have been delegated, I guess, by the people of North Carolina to be the representative stewards of the wildlife resources that belong to all of the citizens. So we should work to do our job the best that we possibly can, be as efficient and effective as possible, and always keep this mission
Oh, muted again.
You're muted again. I think you might be
Thank
hitting the
you.
space bar. Space bar will mute and unmute you.
Okay, I was pushing enter, but maybe everything will mute and unmute me. Anyway, I found it important to look through the history of our line of work and see how we came to our present state. So we think all the way back, like way all the way back, settlers coming to this continent, realizing that there were seemingly endless natural resources that were available to them that were not available to them as people in a monarchical system. They didn't have access to, not everybody could hunt and all that sort of thing. So they come here and they see all of these myriad resources, and then market hunting pervades because of mercantilistic economies and other reasons. But we have overuse of the natural resources through market hunting, and then a noticeable shift by sport hunters, by pleasure hunters after the Industrial Revolution, when folks had more time to get out and hunt just because they wanted to. So from the Lacey Act, which is 1900 on, we see this really rapid change and progression of wildlife conservation being enshrined in law. We have systems and agencies in place to manage and restore wildlife in wild places: the National Wildlife Refuge System, Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, all of those in 18 years from the Lacey Act, which effectively ended market hunting. And then a watershed year, 1933, we're familiar, I'm sure, with Leopold's game management and the institution of the first wildlife management coursework at University of Wisconsin. All of that was only 90 years ago, in 1933. So our profession as a whole is fairly young still. PR passed in 1937. The commission was established in 1947, and the Endangered Species Act passed in 1967. So all of this sort of work has happened in a little bit of no time. So I'm talking about how all of this should be unified, how non-game and game should be sort of one thought. It should be ecosystem management. But there is differences, right, in non-game and game. The funding structure are different. PR and Dingell-Johnson versus sort of an offshoot of that, W57 and state wildlife grant money. Non-game folks are used to working with a lot less money. Someone said working from scarcity. I like that in a way. We have different end user groups, hardcore hunters and anglers versus wildlife, particularly bird, but wildlife watchers, hikers, horseback riders on game lands, lots of different types of people. We have different people interested in specific management. For example, typically someone who's interested in being a deer biologist is not the same type of person necessarily who's interested in being a salamander biologist or a sea turtle biologist. And then there's different types of management concerns. One is maximizing use by people, and the other is minimizing impacts by people. To throw another wrench into that, non-game management doesn't have common objectives for all the species. But notice none of that belies any differences in the critters themselves or how they use the habitat. That's all how people deal with them. So I talked about PR, I mentioned that very briefly a second ago. That's the Wildlife Restoration Act, and then which was 1937, and then Dingell-Johnson Sportfish Restoration Act was in 1950. Those are pivotal pieces of legislation that fund our work. I'm sure we all know that it comes from an excise tax. 11% PR is 11% excise tax on firearms and ammo and archery equipment, and a 10% excise tax on handguns. There's an excise tax for Dingell-Johnson too, sport fish tackle and other things. I don't know enough about the fish side of things to speak intelligently. I will leave that for someone else to do, but we are similarly federally funded on the fish side of things by DJ. This is our federal funding that we received in 2021, 2022. 63% of our federal funds came from wildlife restoration, hunter education, that's PR. And 26% came from Dingell-Johnson. That's a full 89% of the total annual federal funds that we received from those two acts and the grants that we get from them. We also received $1.4 million in SWIG, which is variously spent throughout the wildlife diversity, both terrestrial and aquatic. I found these interesting to look at too. This is our revenues from fiscal year 21. 25% of our revenues came from hunting and fishing licenses, 30% from our federal funds, which also reflects hunting and fishing licenses. It's how PR, somewhat of how PR is apportioned. And then our expenditures, only 8% came from was spent in wildlife management, 9% in inland fisheries. Poor HABCON only got 1%. Land and water access 25%, and I assume that's where game land money goes. But I found that so interesting that thinking about our mission, and that's how money gets spent. I don't know all about it, but I found that interesting. So we have roots that are in game management specifically. Now, of course, other things benefit when you manage for game species, but those are ancillary and somewhat unintended. Those single species management activities can include, make sure there's food, water, cover all year round. That's specific harvest management goals, food plots, providing specific bedding or roost cover, creating woodland openings and other habitat management things, putting nest boxes in, creating impoundments, and even up to stocking individuals into areas. This can be taken too far. So the pendulum can swing way too far on the game management side. For example, managing for deer in too large of a density can lead to degradation of the habitat, even up to a collapse in the seed bank and severe increases in disease prevalence. I like this quote by Aldo Leopold. It says, "I now suspect that just as a deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer, and perhaps with better cause. For while a buck pulled down by wolves can be replaced in 2 or 3 years, a range pulled down by too many deer may fail of replacement in as many decades." I think that's incredibly important for us to keep in mind as we're not only making management prescriptions, but thinking about habitat management as a whole. So moving from a single species game perspective, with the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1967, we had this precipitous increase of wildlife, well, non-game then, wildlife diversity now, programs in wildlife agencies throughout the 70s and into the 80s. And that there was a natural inclination to attack endangered species management the same way that game management had been done, which was focused on a single species. Particularly maybe because the Endangered Species Act was pointing out these few imperiled species that maybe some people felt a moral imperative that we have to save them and we have to save everything. There's a triaging that comes from that, what can we do the best job at saving right now? What doesn't need our help right now? And we can kind of push off to a later time. What's too far gone? That made it kind of easy to translate from single species management of the game that we were used to this non-game. But again, that can go too far too. So Sorry, there was a beep. So for example, managing RCWs at the expense of all else. Get rid of every oak that might have the audacity to grow in a longleaf stand, even when we would naturally see them, like in a draw or on, I don't know, a northern slope. Maybe ideally, we would be managing for a diversity of habitat types in the appropriate places all across the state, even in the Sandhills. When I was thinking through what would be a good picture of that, I don't know about y'all, I love to lift weights. It's a passion of mine and has been for a long time. It made me think of, you hear people say, don't skip leg day. So if you're lifting weights and you're only focusing on your upper body, maybe your chest, your arms, whatever, and you don't lift legs ever, then your arms might look good, your chest might be strong, but it won't be as strong as it would be if you lifted legs too, if you spent time on the whole system. Some parts, so too, managing for a single species rather than considering the whole ecosystem. Some parts might look good, but overall, the whole system is weaker and it's unbalanced and it's out of proportion. So I contend that single species management is not only less effective, or less efficient rather, but it's also less effective. We should be more concerned about the total health of an ecosystem from the plants, plant communities on up to the apex predators, to have everything accounted for, everything considered, and then every part will benefit. So take early successional habitat. That's a pretty easy one. Ecosystem focus would look like this picture looks. It would be an overall healthy landscape. It would provide benefits for a wide range of species and not just one particular species for one particular time, but different species throughout their whole life cycle. We could start by considering what will bring the plant communities into the best balance and representation. And from then on, we would build on that, and the insects that should be there will be there. And if there's the right plants and the right insects, we'll have the right rodents, the right birds, on up to the things that eat those and eat more plants. So on up mesopredators to apex predators. Everything would be in the right balance, all functioning appropriately within their sphere. Each piece of early successional habitat wouldn't just benefit the deer or the grouse, but everything that would be there or should be there would be there. That means healthy, threatened, and endangered hurt populations, or rabbits, or turkey poults, or whatever it should be. So that's all different critters that work within one habitat type. But what if we're trying to manage a larger piece of game lands, for example, across multiple habitat types? We shouldn't even then be single-minded about our work. We shouldn't just be advocating for one habitat type over another. Rather, we need to realize how they all work in concert. They're all necessary. And even when things seem like they're opposed to one another, cooperation inside of our agency with an overarching goal of healthy, appropriate, diverse habitats can mean success for both critters and projects. So I said earlier that I got to speak with lots of different people in the agency, and they were so gracious to give me their time and to really consider the answers that they gave me. And I'm so appreciative of that. One of the great examples that I was given by Chris Kelly was she and Jonathan McCall working together in high elevation forest and meadow management. I thought this was great because, you know, ostensibly these animals need very, very different things. And you might have the tendency to manage for one rather than the other. But they have been able to, because of great communication and teamwork, use their diverse skills. One, how did Chris say it? She said that Jonathan McCall used his forester's eye, which I thought was a great way to phrase that. And Chris used acoustic surveys to look throughout forest types. I won't remember everything that she told me. It was really great. Spruce, fir, and, you know, looking at what different forest types were there. And then where the Carolina northern flag squirrel was, where saw-whet owls were, and where elk were, to really constructively and cooperatively and comprehensively manage a piece of Silver's game land for the benefit of all of these species. So that is a really good example of multiple species across multiple habitat types for the benefit of everyone in the whole ecosystem. But what about when there is conflict, when you can't have everyone win at one time? Good management is good, but smart management, I think, is better. And sometimes that means we need to consider diversity across time, not just across the landscape at one time. So sometimes we deal with conflicting priorities, like when to burn. At that point, we need to be honest about our motivations. Why are we managing this particular piece of game lands, again, for an example, for what at a specific time? So are we focused more on gopher frogs right now, or are we focused more on quail right now? I contend that we should be approaching this with the idea that we should burn at diverse times of year to maximally benefit everything over the long run, because only burning at one time of year isn't the most responsible thing that we could do on that landscape for everything. Yes, that does mean that some years the gopher frogs are going to get hit, or sometimes the ground nesting birds are going to get hit a little bit more. Somebody's going to get short shrift, but over the great span of time, we can benefit the most species and benefit the ecosystem as a whole the best that we can. We can do this most effectively on game lands because, again, we have been delegated the authority to manage public lands, to be an example of really high quality habitat management. We get to set the tone, I think, for the rest of the state and for anyone else who is an interested land manager by how we manage our public lands. These are the places that we really get to work cooperatively. I was excited to see, as I was reading through some game land management plans in preparation for this, but also when I've been fortunate to edit some of them, to see that within the measures of success of a game land management plan that includes both game and non-game metrics. Some of them are a little more hand-wavy than others, but that I think is a good, anyway, a good focus to have, that we're thinking both in non-game and game, not just harvest, but also one of them was even talking about plant communities. I thought that was great. Public land management it's our best shot. This is where the agency facilitating communication and partnerships, not only among divisions, but also in outside partnerships, can be at its best. And that's something we'll talk about in just a minute, is if those are the best that it can be. So we get the most done on public lands, but there are more private lands. Most of North Carolina is privately owned, but we still get to influence the quality of private lands. We can help landowners understand the benefit of wholly healthy ecosystems when we're discussing WCLPs, but not only WCLPs. DMAP clubs, they can be, though they are specifically, for deer, we can help these managers understand that they'll get better results for their deer if they're thinking about the whole habitat, the whole ecosystem. I'm asked often, how can somebody manage their property for barn owls? Well, thankfully, good deer management is good barn owl management because it's good habitat management. And how do you get more bats on your property? I get that asked frequently. If you have the right plant communities, then you can encourage healthy insect populations and you'll get bats. We can help private landowners understand that it's not about one species over another necessarily, but encouraging overall healthy ecosystems and habitats. So we talked from over time, started way back, game management for a single species, moving towards endangered species management, still single species, and moving ever forward into habitat and ecosystem multi-species management. We're working now on the 10-year revision of the Wildlife Action Plan, which is billed as a comprehensive planning tool. And I think it is ever becoming a better comprehensive planning tool. I'm happy that the newer revisions have been more habitat focused. I think that's wonderful. Right now, there are 483 species of greatest conservation need, which include 13 game and migratory game birds and some game fish as well. I've had the good fortune to work quite a bit on species conservation plans for SGCN species and contribute somewhat to the Wildlife Action Plan. And I think that there's so much potential there, but we as an agency need to decide, and just everybody buy in, that either this is the guiding document for the agency, I contend it should be, or it isn't. I think that the more we rely on one guiding document as our goal, one goal that we all agree on, which can come in the form of the Wildlife Action Plan and a habitat-focused Wildlife Action Plan that will have more comprehensive, effective management overall. RAWA didn't happen. So thinking about the utility of the Wildlife Action Plan and realizing that sea change of funding didn't come in this past legislative session when RAWA didn't pass. It has given the opportunity, though, to consider new possibilities. Now, whether that's a new funding structure within the state, I think that would be great. I'll leave that to other people to discuss subsequently. But it certainly gives us an opportunity to consider making better use of what we have. Not only funding, because the funding is somewhat lopsided, but we have the opportunity to make better use of relationships within and without the agency, increase partnerships, because comes in this talk. We are the ones who have been delegated the authority to steward natural resources, but we're not the only ones. There are so many interested agencies and NGOs within the state that are working every day to manage habitat, to manage wildlife, and to increase the overall health of the ecosystems in our state, that it behooves us to strengthen those relationships as best we possibly can, and strengthen relationships within the agency, communication among divisions, and look at our agency structure. So a question to consider, and this is one that I posed to the folks that I spoke with in preparing for this talk, is the explicit dichotomy between game and non-game outmoded? And I realize that we don't even use non-game so much anymore, wildlife diversity, but euphemistically, it's euphemisms aside, it's still non-game versus game. So is that dichotomy explicit within the structure of our agency? Is that outmoded, or is it just semantics and it really doesn't matter? I was not surprised, maybe, and encouraged that everyone I talked to agreed that this explicit dichotomy is outmoded, and though it's not making, let's see, it's not causing harm, maybe, in the type of work that we are able to accomplish, it at the very least is a bit of an impediment in what we're doing, separating game and non-game management. Now, I realize for HR purposes, you've got to have some kind of structure, but we need to facilitate better communication among different parts of the agency, different parts of wildlife management, to better use what we know should be the appropriate management strategies, which is a more holistic, multi-species ecosystem approach. So, have an unpopular opinion in this as well. I don't think that it is the most useful that game lands are out of wildlife management, and I don't know why HabCon's out by itself. Now, again, these are my opinions and not policy prescriptions at all. But it seems like the best thing to do is to knock down as many walls as possible for all the people who are trying to achieve the greatest wildlife management success across the state. Now, I don't have all the answers to this, and I hope that this serves as a good jumping off point for many more productive conversations. So to summarize all of this up, I think that wildlife management should comprehend the entire ecosystem rather than being single species focused, no matter what that species is. An explicit dichotomy between game and non-game is not only unnecessary, but potentially unhelpful. And our staff is working really well towards these ends. We should keep improving, but I am so heartened by the work that we get done, and the people that we get to work with every day that are so dedicated to wildlife management across our state. And that is all I have. I never know how to end these talks. That's all I've got. Now we can do questions.
All right. Thank you, Allison. What a great presentation. Certainly, if that doesn't generate some questions, I don't know what will. I'll remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat. We've got I've been monitoring the folks that are online. We got a good group of folks online. So certainly a lot of potential questions and a lot of potential discussions. While I'm waiting on people to type, I'll start out, Allison. Back in the early 90s, the Fish and Wildlife Service, which at the time also included what's currently USGS, engaged in this really detailed nationwide effort of what they labeled as ecosystem management. And that went through a bunch of iterations, and there were lots of parts to that approach. But when the rubber really met the road, it seemed like in a lot of cases, agencies and individuals still had to pick out either one or a group of species. So how do you go from the high level perspective of an ecosystem management approach to actually figuring out how to put that in place on the ground?
Wonderful question, and I'm glad, I guess, that you started. I didn't mention this in my talk, but one of the things that I read this book, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's proceedings from a non-game management symposium from 1985, I think. And it was all of these questions that they were asking back then that we're still asking now. I don't think necessarily that there's anything wrong with species biologists. Like I even said, I work a lot with barn owls, and we have wonderful bat biologists. I don't think there's anything wrong with specific people being focused in specific areas. Everybody can't be an expert on everything. Everybody can't know about everything. It's the structure of the agency that overtly encourages communication and working together. That starts with recognizing the Wildlife Action Plan as a guiding document and using it a lot, like relying on it a lot. And from there, bringing all of the people to the table for whether it be, managing a certain piece of game lands or how to best have a comprehensive view of how we would encourage private landowners to manage their properties. You can still have individual species experts. It's really about facilitating general communication within the agency and making that a priority, I would think.
Okay. One question is out of the chat is, how do you think federal funding influences how wildlife agencies are structured?
I think I'm coming from a from a wildlife diversity perspective, we don't get to work on stuff if it's not an SGCN for the most part. So that points us to different things. We're going to spend our time and we're going to spend our resources on what we get paid to work on. I guess what we're allowed to work on. So priorities will come in the form of the most money, right? And I don't think that we shouldn't have a really heavy hunter focus. I think that's wonderful. I hunt and I love that hunters get a big say in what we do. I like that there's a lot of game focus in what we do. And again, I'm not advocating not managing for deer in a way. It's just the philosophy behind how we manage things and what we're managing for, what's the end goal. But as far as federal funding, we're structured so that money goes somewhere. And we work on the things that we get money for, rather than it being, maybe less strings attached and saying, you guys as an agency know best how your state should be run, and here's just money, use it for what you will use it for. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, I got you. Anybody else have any other questions? Here we go. Let's see, Allison. Of the folks you talked to, how many worked on projects where a wildlife diversity staff is partnered with a non-wildlife diversity staff person? Curious how much crossover there might be already.
Yeah, so a couple. So I use that example of Chris Kelly and working with Jonathan McCall. So that one specifically, and then spoke with some folks from the Sandhills that work kind of cross collaboratively. But one thing that they specifically said was that they had to forge those relationships themselves, and they had to specifically seek out folks from other divisions to work with, and they had to spend extra time, I guess, facilitating those relationships. Kendrick does a really good job of making sure that everybody and anybody is invited to attend the Western Region staff meetings, the wildlife diversity staff meetings, and I think that is wonderful. Come if you want to, you don't have to, but he is very good at making sure that folks from a lot of different parts of the agency and partners outside the agency have the ability to listen to what we're doing and contribute to planning and jump in on projects and all that kind of stuff. But that's something he has worked to do. And Chris mentioned that they had really good relationships with the Game Lands folks in the mountains before the reorg, and they've had to really work to keep those relationships up when we don't see each other so much at, like, even a whole wildlife diversity meeting wouldn't include the Game Lands folks anymore. So there are some very healthy, thriving relationships among and across parts of divisions, but those have all kind of been hard fought for.
Okay. That'll bring me back to one later on, but for now, I want to stay in the chat. The next question is, I really liked your concept of the movement from single species management to ecosystem management paradigm, and that achieving that is being accomplished now by partnerships and communications between taxa and management experts. How do you see the paradigm progressing in relation to conservation of plant species?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I was happy to see plants added for RAWA stuff, but I don't think that we can really talk about healthy habitats if we're not talking about healthy plants. I am not really a hort person. I don't know that much about it, but I do know that ecosystem wise, they're really important. I'm trying to find that whole question in the chat so that I can make sure I'm answering it.
If you can
Can we-
see them, they're, yeah, it's
Yep,
down there. It's Kendrick's question.
Yeah, I see. I think adding specific people to chime in at every level about plants. We've got critters fairly well covered, but I think a lot of us are maybe out in the cold a little bit with plants. That's not where we've focused so much. So bringing on people who can speak to that, I'll shy away from experts a little. I know how Cobb thinks about experts, but people who focus their time and attention on plants and bring them in, I think that would be really useful and important for this whole progression.
Yeah, I see you remember my list of definitions for an expert.
I do.
The next question in the chat is great overview of many issues and challenges as we move forward. Many of us are already bogged down with the number of meetings, in person and virtual, that we participate in. What are your ideas for improving our communications among divisions in the commission to better coordinate our management?
Part of it is going to be kind of radical, and I might, on the way far end of things, advocate a complete restructuring of the agency to be more ecoregion focused rather than critter type focused. Now, barring that, I know nobody needs to be in more meetings, and more meetings don't necessarily help us get more work done. But making sure everybody knows the right people to talk to is step one. And making sure everybody knows who everybody else is working around them. Again, I'm really blessed because I have the D6 district biologist in my office with me. I'm married to him, and I have a good relationship with a lot of the game land staff. But that wasn't through work, if that makes sense. You're right. Nobody wants to go to more meetings, but somehow some increased facilitation of communication would be expedient. Now, whether that does have to come in the form of a meeting, maybe so, but even to the degree of when people write game lands management proposals, let the people who make sure they need to read them get their eyes on them from all over, and make sure that there's like crossover field work, and that we have the latitude within our work plans to work on other projects completely outside of our purview. I think that would be helpful to help understand. I got to do prescribed burn years ago, had nothing to do with really what I was working on specifically, but it was really, really helpful in helping me understand why we do that kind of management and what it really takes and what it looks like. So even if it's just pure field work with a project that you wouldn't normally do, I think that's really helpful. And we do a lot of that alligator stuff and others, but encouraging that more, I think, would be quite beneficial.
All right, next question is, do you have any thoughts on further integration or crosswalking of the One Health concept or language into more holistic efforts and or our wildlife action plan revisions?
I am not familiar with what One Health concept is, so I don't know.
Okay. we will leave it at that, and we will move to thanks. It can be hard to compile concrete examples and have an accurate picture. Thanks for doing some of the legwork. Another comment about an excellent presentation. I'll ask anybody else if you have any more questions. Put those in the chat, and in the meantime, I'll go back to the one that was generated in my mind from a couple of comments, and that is much of what you're describing is in essence a cultural shift in the agency.
Mhm.
And there has been some of that. I would suggest some of that in both directions. But what you're suggesting is a cultural shift in the agency. And so how do you recommend that the agency pursue that kind of cultural shift?
Well, you'll hear some people say that culture is downstream of politics. That goes both ways, I think. But part of it has to be the agency making an overt effort to change the culture. And I think part of that, you're right, some of that's already being done with the way the Wildlife Action Plan is structured. And I think that it will have to be, if you want it to be done in a timely manner anyway, that it needs to be sort of put out there forthrightly that, this is where our effort is going, and this is what a goal for the type of agency that we have is, and that is to the benefit of hunters and anglers. It's to the benefit of bird watchers. It's to the benefit of the regular old person who hardly steps outside. We have to remember who we're serving, and how we serve them best as agents of the state. And it would be nice if it just happened organically, but I think for it to happen in any sort of timely manner, it does have to be an overt push by the agency itself to help, and that comes from facilitating relationships and maybe some restructuring, but make a point to bring all of the diverse actors of wildlife management and habitat management together to work more cohesively and effectively. And I don't think there's anybody that's disgruntled, and I don't think there's anybody who thinks that we're doing a bad job. I certainly don't. I think we do amazing work, and our folks are so dedicated and they do such amazing work. But it's how operationally and structurally we could do better.
Okay, next in the chat, awesome presentation. For the sake of at least giving 2 examples of crossover, here at Table Rock, we grow lake sturgeon, and McKinney Lake grows robust red horse for aquatic wildlife diversity. So just a couple of comments about some of the ideas that you threw out.
It's wonderful.
Next
Again, I don't know
question.
about fish. But it's wonderful.
Next question is, I've always struggled with when to continue working with a private landowner and when to look at other sites. Most anything that's implemented on private lands most anything that is implemented on private lands has some benefit for wildlife. What are your thoughts on how private lands projects should be screened for commission assistance and then surveyed or evaluated to determine the ecosystem benefits we would all like to see are realized?
Does that happen to be a John Eisenhower question?
It does so happen to be.
The private lands guy himself. I don't know, John. I think that it's hard because we have such limited and finite time, and it's hard to tell somebody that their management goals and objectives aren't good enough or not really what we're looking for. as far as being able to help. And maybe it would be useful to have some sort of boilerplate. I don't know, maybe we already do stuff that we can hand people or they can find on our website. That's like, if you're small time, or if, you're just starting out, these are some things that you can start with. And then when you get a little deeper in, give us a call. I don't necessarily know how exactly that would be, certainly because different parts of the state are managed so differently. I mean, we have such big tracts down east and much smaller tracts up in the mountains. So part of that, again, maybe comes back to the robustness of the potential of the Wildlife Action Plan. And if we have specific management goals for the different ecoregions, and then we can help guide these private landowners into how they would, best use their property to fit the management goals that we've set for the state. John, does that help you out at all? Do we have any more, David?
Yep, sorry, I have to unmute too. As your pie charts demonstrate, those who buy hunting, fishing, trapping licenses, etc., put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. Some agencies have created a stamp or other means of getting wildlife viewers and other recreationists to pay into conservation. What do you think WRC should do to get these users to contribute better to conservation?
That's a really good question. And again, I like that hunters and anglers get to say because they pay, because no other agency works with that group, right? Nobody else works with hunters and anglers. This is where we go, is with the Wildlife Commission. So I think it's great that they do get to pay and have a large stake in what we do. David, I was talking to Tom Paget yesterday, maybe, if you can believe it. He called me about barn owls. We were chatting through some stuff, and he was talking about, way back in the day, they proposed an excise tax for, what did he say? Birdseed, I think. And that the birdseed companies didn't want to go through with that. And Scott and I were recently talking that, how do other states structure their funding? What was it, Scott? Missouri, that has an across the board percent of their sales tax goes to the wildlife agency. I mean, those are some possibilities, make everybody pay, because in one way or another, everybody uses, maybe so. I suppose, the idea of a stamp, but we've seen a lot of hesitancy in the non-hunters, non-anglers. Those types of users are hesitant and reticent to pony up any money to pay for these things. So I think it would, we would have to say, okay, now you have to do this. You couldn't ask in a way, because they don't want to do it. It doesn't seem like they want to do it anyway. But that would also have to have a very broad sort of PR campaign about what all money is used for. But I don't know, in some ways I'm a little hesitant, because I don't know, I like that hunters and anglers pay for a lot of it. Because I've never talked to a hunter who isn't into non-game management as well. These are the folks that tend to be sort of interested in the whole scope of it, particularly those that do management on their own lands. So I don't know, anywhere from from an across the board part of sales tax that pays for the agency. I think that's an interesting idea to follow through with. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure which you're asking, but I mean, I've long
You, the
been a
only one talking.
I've long been a proponent of expanding funding sources for the agency. There's a lot of opposition to that. It all depends on how you craft it and what we've learned. And Rawa and lots of other examples have demonstrated it's all about timing. It's
Yep,
all about
absolutely.
it's all about having your politics right, and it's all about how it's presented. It really needs to be some sort of grassroots effort that convinces the powers that be that it's a good idea.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I'll probably leave it at that. We're down to a couple of minutes. If anybody has one last question, feel free to type it in the chat. Other than that, I'll just say thank you again, Allison, for a great presentation. Certainly very thought-provoking, as you can tell, not only from the questions that are in the chat, but I'm sure from some of the interactions that you have already had in preparing and some of those that you'll have afterwards. But yeah, sorry, I was just reading. But yeah, and as I said in the beginning, the recording of the presentation will be on our agency YouTube channel and on our website. And when those are available, as always, I'll send out an email to everybody. And with that, I'll say thanks for a good attendance, a good engagement. And most of all, thanks, Allison, for your presentation. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.